All right, greetings from the Dark Continent, Conscious Caracal here, or Adams Van Sail, here to shine a light on the goings-on down south here in Africa. But on this episode, we're going to be talking about something that applies to not just here in Africa, but all across the world, something that although also transcends the past few centuries a little bit, something that goes back all the way to the very first humans, and that is words, speech, sounds. The way we communicate. And this is a topic that I've invited someone whose channel I enjoy, Oliver Perrin. He's also known as Semiogogue on YouTube and on Twitter. And he describes himself as a semiotician, and we'll get into what that means. But he's joining me here tonight to talk about speechcraft, power, uses and abuses of speech, the power of words. And I think this is something that is an increasingly relevant topic in a time where a lot of our opponents are absolutely obsessed with the meaning of words, and we shouldn't just mock them for it. We should try to understand why, because there's a lot of power in it. Welcome on the show, Oliver. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I've certainly had you on my channel a few times, and it's always been a pleasure. And this is a subject, as you say, that is very close to my heart. So, yes.
All right. Well, let's start off specifically with what you are, and that is it kind of features in your username as well, and that is a semiotician. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that means or what that entails?
Yes, it's a focus on meaning and how meaning is produced and propagated. Semiotics is basically how it's referred to in the U.S. most often, and then in Europe, certainly as part of the continental tradition, coming out of a linguist from back in the day, a very famous one named Saussure. It's referred to as semiology, but the term itself comes from Greek, and it refers to signs in general. So, for example, we see it in semantics, right? So the basic idea is that it is a focus on communication through signs of whatever sort. And that was classically understood as sort of being an umbrella, these signs. And beneath that overarching umbrella of signs and meaning, you would have language organized. I bring this up here because it's going to be relevant to our further conversation. At a certain point, however, Saussure, who is this pioneer, he's a Swiss guy who, around the turn of the last century, around 1900-ish, was sort of at the peak of his powers and doing a course on general linguistics that his students managed to capture and preserve. And he set forth this idea of a semiology as an overarching category that would contain within it the study of language. But by the time of somebody like Roland Barthes, whom we see in France, in the period of the 1950s and 60s, very famously looking at signification, Barthes comes along and says that actually we have to imagine a translinguistics that would contain all these other aspects of meaning, because really human beings only have one primary and fundamental metaphor for communication, and it is language. And so sort of at a stroke there, although there were other people involved and it happened over time, you saw the idea that there's all sorts of meaning, and then underneath the study of that, we could sort of include language as its own group. We now see the elevation of language as being something that is all-encompassing as a fundamental metaphor. So I focus on the idea of semiotics, although it's a bit strange to call oneself a semiotician. It's not like you can go to school in most places and get a degree in semiotics. You can, but only in a few places do people come out afterwards and claim to be semioticians, and most notably, and in a very shallow fashion, in the world of corporate communications, which I also have a background in. So I focus on semiotics, as I began to say, because it brings back the idea that there are other levels and dimensions of meaning. For example, gesture, music, which, it seems rather odd to conceive of as a language. And for me, in the spoken sense, you understand me, outside of metaphor. And for me, in particular, a focus on writing. Writing very specifically is something that I believe precedes, if one defines it broadly enough, I see writing as something that precedes speech. And perhaps we can talk a bit about that, but it's secondary for our discussion here, which is a focus on language. But what I'm trying to do, I guess, is to underscore the fact that there are many areas outside of spoken language. And for reasons that, again, I think we'll get into, there has been a focus on language because on the left, it was identified as a way to affect changes that they wished to see occur through this medium as a fundamental way of manipulating people. And so I focus on semiotics because it indicates that there is a broader realm than just the language. However, for purposes of our discussion today, it's useful to focus on language itself because that's been the weapon of choice for the left for decades now.
Yeah, and to get the conversation started, let me just name some or just list some words. I think I've chosen just a few just to for the audience and for yourself as well. I've chosen these words to specifically demonstrate how they immediately produce a response in your head, but in regards to specifically controversy and how they influence reality. So these words are, for example, words of our time: progress, equality, crisis, threat to democracy, these types of terms, this type of speech. Then you also have the realm of euphemisms, which is also a very sinister and very cunning realm. And that is, here's some that you might recognize: quantitative easing, instead of saying that you're pumping the economy full of money and printing money. Fortified elections, rather than saying that they were fixed. Load shedding, a South African favorite. Instead of rolling blackouts, we're load shedding. It's not as hard on the ear as rolling blackouts. And there's many of these different examples. But something you'd mentioned there is I definitely want to start with, and that is the modern left definitely has figured it out, and many people throughout history have figured it out. It's not a new phenomenon that speech and words influence reality. You can alter reality with the words and the language you use. This is a very ancient idea. That's why our ancestors very specifically had a big fear and caution about speaking things into the world. That's where superstitions like touch wood or knock on wood comes from, where you say something, for example, like, I haven't been sick in a while. And then our ancestors believe that if you didn't say knock on wood or touch wood, that would actually, you were speaking it into the world. You would become sick that week because you tempted fate. You spoke something into the world. You tempted reality itself. And you see this theme all across cultures from different parts of the world, this very big caution and very taking it very earnestly, the idea of what you speak, you are speaking into the world. Words are not just things that you use trivially. Speech is not just something that you throw around. It can manipulate the reality around you, and you can speak a reality into being. I mean, this is the very first thought that the Bible opens with, is that God spoke the world into being. The very first essence of Genesis is that reality is spoken into being, and it's the very same principle. But humans can do that as well. We can also, through our speech, manipulate reality, and it has its perils, but it also has its advantages and uses.
Yes, the ability to speak is the ability to lie. But certainly it is a creative act. So, as you reference, in the beginning was the word. But there is also the old idea of Hermes, who is a god of mercenaries, gamblers, merchants, envoys, heralds, people who are generally involved in negotiations and communications. The herald's wand, the caduceus, that is the symbol of Hermes, was carried by envoys so that they would be allowed to pass, through battle lines and to speak, between these opposing parties. Again, merchants. It also gives us merchant, mercury, mercenary, market. So you have the idea of the kind of spiel that you would hear, for example, from a merchant in the marketplace. But it's interesting that Hermes, his first dissimulation that he's responsible for early on after he's born, is he steals Apollo's cattle. And, long before he becomes the wordsmith and, the silver-tongued, His first falsehood is to steal Apollo's cattle and attach these things to the animals' feet, so it looks like they're walking backwards when they're walking forwards. So basically, he creates a path that is going in the wrong direction. So it's entirely misleading. I mean, just think of the word misleading, which comes from that same basic metaphor. So with the very god of speech and eloquence and verbal manipulation in the ancient world, we see that the first thing that god gets involved with is manipulation and dissimulation, but starting first with writing, then moving towards writing broadly construed. If you think of tracks on the ground in sequential order as being, in a very fundamental sense, related to the lines of text that you read in sequence across a page. First the wolf crossed the river, and then we see it picked up the trail of the deer, and then it chased the deer down. And not only can we tell the direction of the chase and the series of events, but we can read how the stride of the creature opened up as it ran, right? How these things happened. It's like the very first idea of narrative. Now, this is
you just interpreted a very primitive narrative or story.
Yes, and so when we think about the sequence of characters on the page, we can see that there is a kind of continuity there. Now, I'm just bringing that up in this case to show that there are older and deeper ways that writing might exist even before speech, which is important to bring up, because with the normal way that people look at it, they sort of lock themselves into a circle by saying that, well, the only kind of writing there is the kind of writing that represents speech, which means speech would have to come first necessarily, right? But when you understand that these other things beyond, outside of, and perhaps even deeper than language, then I think there's a very interesting area for all of us to be looking, so to speak, to seize a ground and make it ours the way that the left has done with language. You said a bit earlier on, and you're quite right, that this is the oldest thing on earth. You've got the idea of incantation, right? An incantation, cantare, the idea of singing, right? Speaking the words, conjurations, all these ideas that you can bring it into existence by saying it, or perhaps you need to protect yourself from something. You said, like you mentioned, knocking on wood with the Turks. If you say, oh, what a beautiful little child, if you're walking down the street and you see somebody's kids, you say, beautiful kid, they'll all go, mashallah, which means, God protect me from this. I don't want the evil eye to come down on me because I spoke too highly about this child and excite envy from others. The idea that you must protect yourself from these things. But the point is that you mentioned earlier with this, that it's a very old system, and it did not begin with the left. However, I do want to point out that they have chosen specific ways to go much deeper and more thoroughly into this, systematically and methodically, than we have ever seen in the past. Gramsci himself was a linguist, and he had all kinds of problems in the 1920s when he was trying to organize his communist movements, and the fascists locked him up, and he famously wrote his prison notebooks. And many people credit him with this idea of cultural Marxism and the idea that politics is downstream from culture. Well, really what it was about, that most people don't realize, Gramsci was a trained linguist. And so it's not really so much that politics is downstream from culture. That's how it was summarized later. It was more the idea that you could create a social reality through language. There's actually a bit here from some of his last writings that I figured would be worth plugging in here, if I may quickly, because it lays out the basic idea of how the left has been using language all this time, notably against people who are sensible centrists who don't want to get involved in all kinds of mad extremism. The crucial concepts that form the rest of Gramsci's prison writings and that have attracted so much attention from political scientists, sociologists, cultural theorists, and literary critics can be seen quite easily in the dynamics and processes Gramsci describes in Quaderno 29, which is one of his late writings. The central problematic is the question of how a collective popular will is formed. That is, how our heterogeneity and multiplicity, think about things like intersectionality to bring these disparate groups together, right? How are heterogeneity and multiplicity transformed into a collective unity? Put another way, what is the difference between a state that is the expression of the collective will of the multitudes who constitute it and a state that represents the will only of a specific group and forces that group's conception of the world onto other social groups? This question is analogous to a narrower question. What is the difference between an artificial language such as Esperanto or even Tuscan relative to the rest of Italy and an organic national language created by a real unification of Italy in what Gramsci terms a war of position? So he was after a sense that language and political power could not be separated, and that the way in which to bring together fragmented groups to overthrow what he saw as an unjust government was to shape their language, to create a sense of collective identity through doing so. And so the last point to throw in, again, along the lines of, yes, this is a very old thing, but what they're doing with it now is very new. You know, first they tried to do things like tell us that there are certain things we can't say, right? Like you can call a black person black, but you can't do it with the Latin word for black, right? Even though there's a country that's named the Latin word for black that's still on everyone's maps, and I can't even say it, right? Or you can't say that they're colored people. You have to say that they're people of color. You know, we're all familiar with this sort of nonsense, but they've gone deeper now into things like pronouns and into the grammar itself. Think about what happens in terms of mental operations when you have a fundamental idea of a singular or a plural, and now you're talking to someone who insists on being referred to as them. You know, it brings to mind the idea, you know, my name is Legion. You know, am I talking to a single person? Am I talking to a schizophrenic? You know, what, I mean, literally, not to you know, them, it's plural. How many personalities are there? And what is the central unifying thing that holds them together, if indeed there is? And so when you start to change pronouns, when you start to play games with gender, which really only is appropriate in language, masculine and feminine forms, again, pronouns, which are deeper than nouns in some senses, because they get used in so many ways. I, me, you, them, you know, that's something different, and it's methodical.
Absolutely. And I just want to highlight here a comment in the chat. Clockwork ZA posted there, Proverbs 18 verse 21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. No, the big, that's exactly the important point, is that what we're dealing with here is things that people thousands of years ago understood. This is not some new technology. It's not some new revelation. It's not a modern phenomenon. It's just been appropriated by a new faction within the great soap opera that is humanity. There was another thing that's also important, and that's to get to a point earlier that you mentioned about incantation. You have to, I mean, that's the classic idea of a spell. You have to say the right words, and then it brings forth a type of reality or manifestation. There's a very simple way you can demonstrate that. I can demonstrate a mind control spell right now. And it's the one you've probably heard when you were a child, when someone tells you, don't think of a pink elephant. Just controlled a lot of my audience's minds. The thing is, you can use certain terminology and certain ways of manipulating language to make people think certain things. And even I go very far with the power of language. I think you can make people see things through the language that they use, through the manipulation of their language, because they think in language and in symbols. And if you can hack and manipulate those symbols and language, you can manipulate their thoughts to a point where if you apply it expertly and masterfully enough, they will not believe their lying eyes. They can see all the data and all the statistics and all the reality and all the objective reality they want. They will still see almost literally the reality that they've been programmed to see. I've seen it many a time with people that have been very thoroughly programmed. And you program someone through the language that they use. This is what the manipulators of our time and the manipulators 5,000 years ago understood. So if you control the language, if you control the symbols, you control the mind, you can control actions, you can control behavior, you can even control what people see and hear, up until the point where, like I said, they will not believe their lying eyes or ears, because they have been manipulated in that way. And it's very powerful. This is where, for example, you can manipulate through emotion specifically. That's a fan favorite of the manipulator, is where you can use certain words and terminology and symbolism to evoke emotions in your subject, which will then lead them to action. If you label someone the correct terminology of the age that designates an enemy, that designates a foe, you will automatically evoke anger and the desire to attack or eliminate or exile within many people, most people in society. That is mind control. That is manipulation through simple words. Just using the right label for someone evokes desires for certain actions, usually negative if it is enemy, usually positive if it is friend or ally. But it's the certain terminology and labels of the time that are used as incantations to quite effectively manipulate people, often to action.
Yes, I agree. However, there are a couple points where I want to at least suggest the possibility that there might be more going on. Again, you say that this is as old as time, and certainly it's as old as human language, which is old. And we see it in rhetoric, as you say, with the idea of associating things with a virtuous behavior or vicious behavior. Cicero talks in his training for rhetors that survives about the need to be able to conjure the images of virtues and vices in the minds of people as you speak. Certainly your point is borne out with the idea of poetry itself, the idea of the poet as someone who could evoke imagery, and then those stories, those images, those tales which are evoked by the speech become core aspects of the culture and shape it. And if you have anything that you want to survive for later days, then it must exist in your stories and the rest that you tell your children and that become aspirational ideals. However, I again want to emphasize that there's something different between using words to program, to manipulate, to convince. If you look at Latin for convince, convincere, or it's basically to enchain. So you could think about the old idea, the Greek sophists, where you can so confuse people and befuddle them with your speech that you can convince them that black is white and white is black. Yes, all of that is there. But what I want to point out are two things. One is that these rhetoricians were not trying to empty the language of meaning. They were trying to use the language in certain ways to create perceptions, and the left continues to do that very much as you say, certainly, and it's as old as time. But the ways in which they're doing it, by trying to empty words of meaning to create total ambiguity and confusion around all terms, to where you don't even know what the term means anymore. I mean, at this point, I think it's less about us being forced to use particular terms and more about creating a pause within us between our desire to speak and our speech, so that before we ever open our mouths, there's a sudden sort of I need to think to make sure I'm not going to say anything to offend anyone. And is this a subject I'm even allowed to make an utterance about? Like, these are some new things. The other deal is you mentioned the idea that reality and our thought processes are shaped by language. Yes, they are, certainly. And we see that, with logic. Some of the old statements, we see ways in which people, that even the ancient Greeks, tried to make simple logical statements and treat them almost like math, like a syllogism, so you could check it, right? And that was the idea that this speech was true and that it could be almost mathematical, right? But the reality is that there's so much ambiguity in it, and there is so much well, let me come at it from a different direction. Basically, you've got the idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it's not truly that, but that's what it's generally called. If anyone wants to go look it up, it's SAPIR hyphen, I think, WHORF. It's another left-wing idea, or modern left-wing variant of an older idea, which is that the words that you can use will shape your reality. However, there are whole places that those words don't go. There are whole ways that we think or feel or have impulses to action or are motivated by behavior that fall outside these boundaries. This is strange because we're talking about Speechcraft today, and I'm constantly coming over here to say, but wait, there's this over here and there's this over here, because I feel that we all ought to know that. And you will see that the left knows it too, which is why they're very careful to control things. They do not like abstract symbols. If you're in Europe and you're doing generation identity and you have flags with a lambda symbol on them, they will eventually take close notice of that and come in and ban the use of that symbol. That's not speech. There might be a particular kind of salute, like, for example, an old ancient Roman salute. And I'm not saying that, I run around doing Roman salutes, but my point is that we could see that they come in for non-linguistic symbols like lambdas or crosses or swastikas, and they come in for different salutes and gestures. They understand that there is a whole range of other things that do shape our society. And so I'm pointing out that there are some things outside of language that bear on this, and also that there are places that language can't go where we can do things like think, or something like it, where we can come to know things, where we can have, think about the most powerful religious experiences that people have. They're often epiphanies that they cannot put into words. And yet those are core aspects of our cultural and social experiences. So yes, speech is important. We should be aware of it, but there are a lot of things outside of it. And if we can be cognizant of those, then it is possible for us to simply step out of some or over some of these verbal traps that they try to put into place. And even more interesting to me, which is what I'm involved in my own work, is that if we understand deeper levels of human social organization that come before speech, then we can, like Shakespeare talks about, one group is trying to mine their way up to the castle walls to place explosives there and blow them. But then they talk about mining even deeper underneath them and placing an explosion so they'll be, hoisted by their own petard. If we understand ways that we can get around and beyond language and go perhaps even more deeply than language, and I think things like gestures and old signs are like that, which is why they prevent us from using them, then perhaps we can take a significant advantage on the field.
Right. And I do think that would be a worthy segment in this conversation. I think closer to the end, I want to get into your specific, the tunnel under the tunnel. But before we get to that, I think to give you an idea of what I want to talk about next, you on your channel, when you did an episode on this topic as well, you told the joke about the lawyer and interpretation of a contract. And I just want to, before we get into that, this is a very important topic for our time, which is why I want to get your thoughts on that, the whole idea of interpreting words, because in South Africa specifically, it's incredibly relevant when it comes to like a document, for example, like the Constitution in South Africa, where, as my colleague Adams Roots has remarked, the Constitution is not a supreme document. It's not the document with the most power. All the power is not seated in the Constitution. The power is seated in the one interpreting the Constitution. The Constitution can say what it wants. It can stand on its head and scream until it's blue in the face. If the person interpreting the Constitution says otherwise, then that person's holding the power. And we see this today in South Africa, where the Constitution can clearly be contorted in so many ways, where it can produce pretty much anything. It can say anything it wants. It's almost like a ventriloquist puppet, where whoever is wielding the puppet can make it say whatever it wants. It's almost like that whole concept of statistics as well. If you torture them enough, they can tell you whatever you please. And that's why I wanted to bring up, well, not just law, but specifically interpretation of words and contracts and law, and how that applies today. And I think I'm not an expert joke teller, so I think you can start off with the joke that I'm talking about, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts specifically on the interpretation and manipulation through specifically how it applies to the realm of law and constitutions and documents and contracts.
Well, I should first warn everyone that my knowledge of law is weak, very weak. Shockingly so. But the joke, let me see if I can try not to screw it up. There's a guy who has a very serious legal issue. And so he decides he wants to review some attorneys in order to figure out which one he's going to go with. So he brings the first attorney in and he says, I'm interested in this particular legal point. What can you tell me about it? What does this really mean? And the first attorney says, well, according to English common law. And the guy's like, just stop right there. Leave. And he's like, next. He brings in the next guy and says, what does this point of law mean? And the guy says, well, if we look at continental law, which it manifests as statutorily as blah blah blah, the guy's get out of here, right? Brings the last lawyer in, and he says, well, there's this point of law. Can you explain it to me? What does it really mean? And so the lawyer goes over, locks the door behind him, makes sure it's locked. He walks over, he pulls the blinds down and looks out, makes sure he's not being watched. And he comes in, leans in real close to the guy and says, what do you want it to mean? And
no, exactly. That's the point.
Yes. And and that fits perfectly with what you're talking about here, where they try to turn the meaning, to twist it. And that goes back to the sophists. That's the first place you will find it in and around the 6th and 5th century BC. And there are a number of fragments of sophistic texts that survive. They come from the context of rhetoric. And by the time of Plato, you can, Plato writing as though he's Socrates, you can see a clear distinction there where the Platonists set themselves apart from, and as opposed to the sophists. And the way that the Platonists mocked the sophists was to say that they were concerned with, convincing someone, as I was saying earlier, that black is white and white is black, whereas the idea of rhetoric for the Platonist was through the dialectical exercises that you see Socrates go through in his dialogues. The participant is supposed to be led through rhetoric to the truth. It's not a matter of expediency. It's not a matter of saying that white is black if it's useful for us to say so, or vice versa. So, yeah, I don't know what particular angle you're interested in. I can say just out of the gate that because of this ambiguity, there's an enormous amount of attention in law that a properly legally trained person can discuss.
Not in that regard. I want to pick your brain specifically on the uses and abuses of interpreting contracts, the Constitution, how that is applied today politically and in the process of manipulating people and getting the reality that you want, specifically by our foes.
Yeah, I wish I could talk more about the legal aspect. I do know that, as I began to say, there's things like Black's Law Dictionary. There is the idea of defining your terms, and in contracts you will find, as everyone watching doubtless will know, that there will be a page with terms. Now some of these are terms of art, like I was talking about with Thomas. You've got a term, some certain, and that's a very specific thing. It's not just the amount that you'll be paid. If you've been paid some certain, there are a number of concomitants and legal ramifications to you using that terminology. And so because of an overabundance of caution and a desire to avoid this ambiguity, they establish definitions in contracts. And as I said, they have things like Black's Law Dictionary. But it's like you were talking about earlier, it's the person who interprets the Constitution that matters. And what that really comes down to for me is that it's the people and their character that matter. People will be like, we need to defend the Constitution. And I'm like, well, why? Everything's gone to hell. It doesn't, I'm not saying that I wouldn't defend my own country's Constitution, but it's or for example, when people say we need to change the system, people will come in all the time and say that this is done, we've got to change the system, we've got to have something new here. And I'm like, no, because of this very ambiguity we're talking about, you could almost take the worst possible constitution, and if you had righteous, upright, honest, good people, in charge, they could interpret even the awful stuff as though it were proper and in such a fashion that good could come of it. It has much more to do with the people themselves. And so
exactly the opposite is also applicable, where you can have the best, most solid, bulletproof, waterproof constitution in the world, but if it is interpreted by twisted people, it will be twisted in exactly how they want. They just need they just need enough time to figure out how they're going to interpret it to mean what they want. And when they've got that, the constitution will sing like a canary in any tune they want.
Right. They can basically twist its arm to justify the most foul extortions and impositions. But it comes back to, I think, this fundamental aspect of speech, which is that the ability to speak, to pull a Hegelian or Derridian angle on it, the ability to speak is always already the ability to lie. So, the idea of the magus in the old tarot cards, and of course the magus has this old set of associations with Hermes, the magician, and you've got they'll call it le battleur or a jongleur, like a juggler, right? Like prestidigitation, sleight of hand, and they'll show a man with the table with playing cards, or like the equivalent of like 3 shells, and they're moving them around to see which one. It's all about misdirection, and that aspect of speech, it's native to speech itself. And linguists will often talk about it. I won't go deeply into it, but the basic idea is that the relationship between what you're signifying, and this goes back at least to Saussure, the thing you're signifying and its signifier have an arbitrary relationship. Like, how do you say red in Dutch?
In Afrikaans, you'd say rooi.
Rooi, right? And we'd say in English red, right? And what is it? Is it ahmar in Arabic? I can't remember. And in Turkish, certainly it's kırmızı. Now, rooi, red, kırmızı, these words have nothing to do with each other. They have no similarities, and yet they all refer to red. And this is what I'm trying to get at with the fundamental aspect of speech. We say that the relationship between the signifier and signified is arbitrary. There's no necessary relationship between what we're calling red in different ways and rooi, kırmızı, or red. That means that it's done by convention. So we can take the meaning and the thing that represents it, and we put them together arbitrarily. And so what's happened with the left, and with people who believe that they can twist legal language, to come back to your main point, wherever they want, they've said, well, the relationship is arbitrary. So it's a living document that changes with the times. You see, these same things that we see in law go back to old things like the religion of the book and particular traditions of how you interpret scripture, right? So you can hear about fundamentalists or people who take the text of the scripture literally, right? And then other people will come in and they'll say, well, no, if we want to see with the eyes of Christ, then what we need to do is understand that this is a possible Christian, and just because they're attracted to the other sex doesn't mean that we should judge them harshly. You see, the words will still sit there on the page the same way, and yet we'll come in from one direction or the other and argue for, well, it must be the plain literal meaning of the text when it was written. Or you can say that God, in his infinite wisdom and goodness, is capable of laying down words for all time, and that's what makes a sacred text sacred, whether you're talking about the Bible or the Quran. And I bring this up because you see how it's the same thing going on with traditions of interpreting legal documents. You've got people on the Supreme Court right now some will come in and say, no, there was a plain intention expressed by the founders at the time they wrote these documents. And other people will be like, no, they need to be interpreted freely based upon the standards of the day. So I guess what I'm getting at is it's a much deeper issue about meaning itself. And so as soon as we begin to wade into these waters, it doesn't take much for someone of low character to slide in and begin to arbitrarily shift things around to suit them.
Right. And yes, one more thing I want to explore before we get to that topic of specifically the thing that's underlying the speech and the language, the meaning itself, your field of study, if I can call it that, is specifically something I've picked up as an Afrikaner, because when you mentioned what is this word in your language, I immediately thought of just the language of Afrikaans, and it's a language that's constantly under assault here in South Africa. There's no other language that is more targeted viciously than Afrikaans by the state and by the government. It's there's no two ways about it. It's a language that the government of the day want gone. They want it destroyed, and you have to ask yourself why. Why are they expending all of this energy, all of this time and money, and just resources attacking a language? Why are they trying to exile this language from every public institution, from specifically education? Why do they want to expel it from everywhere, and why do they want it gone? But the answer, you can see, it's not something that the ANC government thought up. It's also one of the old ideas that our ancient ancestors already realized, and that is, if you destroy a language, you very often mortally wound a culture. Many cultures are so deeply rooted in their language. If you were to take their language away, or if you were to anglicize them or give them another language, their culture would die as well. The British Empire understood this very well. I mean, we've talked in private a long time ago about specifically the anglicization that the British Empire did. They did it with a very specific purpose. Here in South Africa specifically, where when they annexed took over the Cape in 1806, they set out on a process of very rigorous cultural suppression, but specifically anglicization in regards to language. Why is that their obsession? Because they know once you've once you've destroyed the language of the people you're trying to subvert or trying to subdue or trying to make yield, you often mortally wound their culture, or at least buckle their culture to a point where they lose their balance, and now they're on the wrong foot, or they are in a much worse off situation. They're fighting to preserve their language, and they're fighting a war on increasing fronts. But the main front is language, and you see it in South Africa with the targeting of Afrikaans. And MP van Wyk Louw, one of the greatest Afrikaner philosophers, wrote specifically about this. He wrote about language being, and I wanted to cover this before we get into your ideas of meaning, because this will lead into that. You'll see now, because MP van Wyk Louw's theory was that language is the bedrock of the river that culture flows in. So culture is the water of the river, language is the bed of the river. And if you were to remove the bed, the water just falls through into the abyss below, into the dark void. And that's the thing when it comes, what regimes like the ANC regime understood. That's what regimes like the Mussolini regime understood when they went in the 1920s, initiated the process of Italianization on the South Tyrolean minority, the Austrian minority in Italy, where they very explicitly and very forcefully tried to Italianize them, outlawed German, made it illegal to have German schools, made it a criminal offense to teach children in German. Regimes that want to remain in control and want to subvert and destroy their enemies and pesky minorities know exactly how it works. You destroy and subvert and make them yield by attacking their language, because if you destroy the language, you either destroy the culture or you wound it very deeply. And that's an idea or a theme that I think is going to come more to the fore as we move into the years ahead, because I think that's the modus operandi of the globalist agenda as well. So if you just anglicize the whole world, everyone just becomes English, and it makes people much easier to control and also to standardize them.
Yeah, it gives you, as you're hinting there, a common denominator. It's almost as though it doesn't matter what the lingua franca is. Of course, that expression suggests to us that once upon a time it was French that would be the diplomatic language, right? Further back, it was Latin, right? But whatever the lingua franca is, their major concern is to make it global and then you will be in a position where, okay, well, look, we've got a global common denominator. We can shift it around. We can already play games with English. We can dismantle it before everyone's eyes, even referring to single people in the plural, changing around pronouns and all the rest. So yeah, there is that. And of course, implicit in what you mentioned is not just that it will affect the culture, it will affect the nation. In nation being a group of people who share territory, culture, history, and genetics, arguably, right? There are different ways and different emphases that you can place on the model. But in addition to those, you've also got the idea of language itself. So, it's very easy, for example, to say, oh, this is a distinct group of people, because when I cross the border, they can talk to each other, but I can't talk to them,
And they can talk about me not behind my back, but to my face, and I won't know what they're saying.
Exactly. And so, given that is one of the fundamental ways in which a nation is itself defined, it makes perfect sense that they would want to remove the sound of that troublesome tongue from their ears. And so we have seen that take place over and over again. And as you say, you can be mortally wounded when your language is attacked in that fashion. I spent a lot of time studying the Circassians, and there was a people known as the Ubich. And the Ubich was one group of Circassians that got driven out in 1864, 65, after the Russians took over the Caucasus. They went to Turkey, to Anatolia, and resettled there. And for a time, their language persisted. But, as recently as the last 20 or 30 years, the last living native speaker raised in that language died. So now it's old cassette recordings, Now, you could say I'm Ubich. You could say my grandmother was Ubich. Let's say that, genetically, in some respects, you will have these traces, and culturally, right? Aspects of their dance remain. They remember some of their fashion and clothing, right? But you're on a pretty rapid course to disappear as something separate at the moment that your language disappears. So I could not agree more.
A majority of my ancestors were French Huguenots, but I don't speak French. The only French I know is omelette du fromage and bonjour. And I don't see myself as French. I have no connection. I have no pride in Napoleon's triumphs. I have no connection to Paris or to any of the great cities in France. I don't see myself as French, even though genetically I'm probably the closest, even though I'm quite the mongrel. If you look at where most Afrikaners, our lineage comes from, I mean, just me as a case study, I'm a combination of German, Belgian, French, Dutch, and Scottish. So that's a wide range of different influences, but it all congregates into my culture and into my cultural identity, which is Afrikaner. Now,
well,
Oliver,
I just ask?
Yeah, sure.
Just very quickly, since you speak something that is closely related to Dutch, even though you primarily have a French genetic background as well as all the other things mixed in, you don't feel that connection with France. However, since you do speak a language that's related to Dutch, what is your feeling about Dutch culture? Does it seem like an echo of something to you?
A very, very faint echo. I've visited the Netherlands. I've talked to a lot of Dutch people, and it's like it's like when you meet someone and you realize that your great grandfather's cousin, you share like a very far off ancestor. You don't really see them as your family. You don't say, oh well, let's catch up on the family history. You're like, oh, that's novel, that's interesting, and you go on. I don't. The Dutch are very far removed from the Afrikaner culture, where I think you could say we are cousin folk, but not an Afrikaner that moves to the Netherlands would radically have to change his culture and his idea of his identity to fit in there. So it would not be just a simple transition. But I would have to add the footnote as well that I see a lot more connection between, for example, me and a Dutchman than between me and a Czech or between me and a Russian. But I mean, that's just a matter of contrast and a matter of close history and heritage. But it's the divide is very far. Afrikaners have shaped a culture here in Africa that's quite distinct. Even though from the outside looking in, you say, "Oh, it's just an Africanized Dutchman," but it's a bit more nuanced than that. But yeah, Oliver, I want to give you the opportunity now, seeing as we're approaching the end. I want to give the last topic that we cover, and you don't have to feel rushed. I want to get into. We've talked about now, metaphorically speaking, what's happening on the surface, maybe even a one tunnel deep below the surface. But you've got your own theory and idea of what's even below that, even below the subterranean level, something going on very deep, almost at the core of all of it. Can you? I mean, we don't have an hour, but we also don't just have 5 minutes. Can you give us me and the audience a little introductory 101 on what you think lies below everything we've talked about in this conversation so far? I think that would be a intriguing a place to end it. You're still muted there. Cool.
Sorry, I think I got it right. Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. The basic idea I laid out.
But like I said, don't feel like you just have 5 minutes. You've got we have quite a lot of time still.
Well, the basic thank you. The basic idea is that very arbitrariness that I mentioned. If I can say Roy or and I think the Germans, you call it Rooibos, the Germans I think call it Rotbusch or something, right? Yeah. We'd say red bush, that arbitrariness, that is, it's basically a variation of the idea of the tabula rasa. If we can assume that the relationship between meaning and what symbolizes it is always arbitrary, then it's very simple for us to say, well, no, let's just adjust it slightly. These relationships of meaning are arbitrary. That's a very, very, very different idea than the Western notion for centuries, millennia even, that there was a divinely ordered world, that speech was a fundamentally creative thing, that oath making and the swearing of oaths was the most serious business, particularly for a man to be taken seriously. And no less important, for example, in relationships between parents and children, husbands and wives. So against a background of thousands of years of thinking that speech, true speech, and, as we would summarize it, say what you mean and mean what you say, against the background of that, we're now in a situation where the idea is, well, it's all arbitrary. And anyway, human beings are totally arbitrary. A he can be a she, a white person can become a black person. I'm sorry. Anyway, all this crazy nonsense that they've come up with. So it's completely arbitrary. And again, I want to emphasize that really goes hand in hand with social engineering, with utopianism, with the idea of the tabula rasa. Man isn't really anything. Man, like his language, has arbitrary relationships of meaning, which means that it's up to us as the social engineers in our wisdom to create the brave new world, the future that we wish, because really it's all arbitrary. Again, blank slate. Now, that's at the level of speech, of spoken language. And we know that all over the world, there are different languages, but they can still talk to each other. They can still talk about the rain coming down. They can still talk about the sun being in the sky, or their sadness or their loneliness. The basic idea is that in some fashion or another, all peoples, no matter what language system they use or what arbitrary words, they can communicate meaning. Well, I believe there's something deeper in that than that. And that's why I mentioned writing broadly construed earlier. If you think of writing only as representing speech, then naturally there couldn't be writing before speech. But if you understand it as non-kinetic forms in space that are relatively lasting, that organize behavior, then you're talking about something much deeper and older, and I would argue something that forms a continuum from animals through to human beings. And when we say non-kinetic forms in space, I'm taking a definition from a brilliant scholar, semiology, Roy Harris, the late Roy Harris. When you talk about non-kinetic forms in space that are used to integrate and regulate human behavior, and then when you throw in my little bit, which is there's a continuum ranging through the various animal kingdoms, from insects leaving spatial markings with scent to organize themselves socially, up through lizards marking their territory with piles of scat, up through mammals scratching marks, so-called advertising, on the bark of trees so that other mammals of the same species can see that they're entering someone else's territory, which affects to distribute them throughout their region, marking mating sites, marking nesting sites, right? Marking their
just
young with scent.
Quick thought there. I always find it so fascinating when they put a tracker on animals that have very vast territories, and you see they very rarely cross into each other's territory. They almost know as if there's a red line painted on the ground. You see these animals that are tracked on a map, and you see all their territories almost like national borders, just touch each other and then they move on, as if, like I said, almost as if quite literally there's a red line on the ground that they don't even put a foot over it.
And indeed there is. That's what's the craziest. That's why I need to get in with some hard sciences people, because they've shown now in the hippocampus, excuse me, and I believe it's called the entorhinal cortex. Basically, they've recently discovered place and border/boundary cells. So it's crazy. They can, I believe it's with an fMRI, but I'm not positive of that. It's been a long time since I read this part, so bear with me. But the basic idea is that you can see cells firing in the brain of a rat, and the pattern in which the cells fire is literally a spatial analog for a border it's coming up against. And of course, the hippocampus is tied to memory and orientation in space. So when you talk about how one animal's boundaries bump up against another one and how they sort of patrol their border, and there'll be little overlaps here and there, but for the most part, they're distributed. And what does that do? It sets apart the available parts of the biotope for the various animals. It minimizes intraspecific violence, right? It works out basically as like you have your own little county and it has a border and it's recognized, and you can rely in terms of your resources relative to other members of your species on this domain as being yours. So that's one aspect that carries over to human beings. They put terminus stones down. They'll wrap red bands around trees to mark their borders. That's borders and boundaries. But it also works in terms of hierarchy. As I've mentioned many times, animals will come and they'll piss on the side of a tree trunk in order to mark their territory, and another animal comes along and smells it, right? But as they smell up and down that tree trunk, and I may have even mentioned this to you in the past, they'll get to a particular height. And in doing so, they'll recognize the height of the animal, because based on its anatomy, the stream is going to hit the tree at different heights. So if it sniffs up like this, it goes, oh shit, whatever animal I just came across is twice the size that I am. I better not screw with them at this border. And they've even videotaped pandas turning upside down in order to pee higher on a tree to make themselves see bigger, to threaten animals that might come into their territory. So what we just talked about here is, in a plain view, you've got, looking down from above, you've got borders of nations. That's boundaries. That's nationalism. That's borders. That's a thing that's fundamentally of concern to us. Then you've got the idea of hierarchy, the vertical axis, and marking it to indicate your size and your rank. You've also got the idea of regularly marking those boundaries because they're yours. Now, there's a lot more than that I can't go into here, but basically hierarchy, national territory, and boundaries are fundamental to this sensible centrist. They're fundamental aspects of what we care about. We want our territory. We believe that hierarchy is natural and should be related to merit and capacity, right? The left is against borders. It wants to erase all of them, just like languages and cultures, in its great arbitrary experiment, which corresponds to the way they see language as having arbitrary meaning relationships. But what I'm talking about is something that's so non-arbitrary that it's physically related to the distribution of species in space, and it runs as a continuum from insects all the way up to human beings. That's not arbitrary at all. And the left, that has focused so much on language and weaponized that area, they're only half conscious of everything I'm talking about here, because they're so intensely anthropocentric that they do not want to see themselves as part of a continuum with the rest of nature in God's great chain of being. And so I see a great opportunity, and that's my work, is to basically, I want to do what the leftists did. I've mentioned before that that if you look at things in terms of unrestricted warfare, then the funding of linguistic departments that have been used to subvert our language and our discourse, that can be seen as a military investment. I want to do for the sensible centrists the same thing, but I want to delve deeper to a level of communication that fundamentally has to do with borders, territory, and hierarchy. But it's so non-arbitrary that it's directly a part of relationships in space, and is a part of our animal inheritance going back not just through species, but through whole biological categories of life.
Right. Yeah, what you're describing is a world that I think our ancestors understood a lot better, something that they were in tune with a lot more. But it's a world that doesn't care about your definition of a recession. It's a world that doesn't care about your definition of an enemy, or what your specific dictionary manipulation you did today. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about your dictionary. So I completely understand what you're getting at, and all the best of luck to you. It's a monumental and ambitious project that you're embarking. But yeah, it's something that I would definitely recommend my audience. You can go check out on Oliver's channel. There's a link in the description. You can see a little bit of his journey down this ambitious path. Oliver, we've reached the end of the stream. I just wanted to quickly highlight one thing that I found very funny. Sideliner opinion says great pronunciation of Rue, Oliver.
Rue.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. What I also wanted to just point out, it's not when you were talking about arbitrary things, it means in this language it means this, in this language it means this. In Afrikaans, we have a lot of very creative descriptions of things. So, for example, what you would just call a bush with a curved thorn. Any bush with a curved thorn in Afrikaans is called a waggebikkie bush or a waggebikkie bos, which means a wait a minute bush. So any bush with a curved thorn, you designate as a wait a minute bush, because you're going to wait a minute when it taps on your shoulder.
Get off carefully. we call that down south blaspheme vine, where you get hooked by a particular kind of briars, and they have a hooked thorn that's very sharp, and you have to start, damn it, you start blaspheming. Yes.
Right. And another one is just a trapsiki, which is the Afrikaans for a chameleon, is a cautious treader. So if you've ever seen a chameleon walk, it walks with its feet like this, almost like it's aiming, and then it grabs, and then it's very, very neurotically cautious about where it puts its foot next, and then it grabs. So it's the beauty of language and meaning, which is the more I wanted to add on end on a bit more of a lighter note. The beauty that is locked within speech and within language is that it can be a very humble form of artistic expression as well, describing the world around you in very creative and also humorous ways. It's deeply interwoven into the human experience.
I agree completely. And that's why, despite the fact that the languages are arbitrary, they're beautiful. They are our inheritances. And so we should attempt to defend them and maintain them, And sadly, that's just another one of the battlegrounds, we have to find a way, metaphorically speaking, of course, to meet these people on these various battlegrounds and defend what's most important to us, despite the fact that it's arbitrary. As you said, your language, certainly for you, my language, certainly for me, is I'd be naked and dispossessed if it were removed from me, So we must defend it, I guess. I agree.
Absolutely. Well, Oliver, again, thank you very much for your time. And then also, anyone, if you're interested, I'm going to give you one final opportunity, Oliver, to show your content. Where can people find you, and what can they expect if they were to take the mysterious route to go find your content?
Well, I cannot fully endorse myself because I'm half mad some of the time. And also, I'm more concerned with having fun. So I'm more like the grasshopper than the ant in the old Aesop's fable. And so, yeah, sometimes I'm more concerned with having fun than seriously approaching my subject. So, if you come, your mileage may vary. Check it out. You agree, perhaps, or perhaps you'll disagree. If you are specifically interested in the stuff I mentioned about marks and signs and this broader project, there is a playlist on my channel called Mark Studies, and it has one of my presentations that I did in the Swedish Parliament in Stockholm. It has another one that I did in Leiden University. So there's some more background there if anyone wants to see it in terms of how they find me. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Gab, I'm on Telegram, I'm on Odyssey, I'm on YouTube. Check me out in all those places, BitChute as well. And in terms of things coming up, I believe on Thursday, I will be talking to a number of interesting gentlemen as a follow-up to a previous stream we did looking at the Polish strategic idea of Prometheanism as a way to splinter and weaken the Russians. We talked about that some time back, so we'll be doing a part 2 this Thursday. So yeah, that's where you can find me. And thank you, Ernst, very much for having me on yet again.
No, well, it was a fascinating conversation. And then lastly, just thank you for everyone that tuned in. Thank you for all your great comments and all of your questions. And I know it takes a lot to dedicate an entire hour or more to a in-depth conversation. And thank you very much for everyone that stuck around. And then also thank you to everyone that shares the content, that comments, that leaves a like, helps out the show. It helps get this content to more people. But I enjoy where my channel has gotten to. I really like the space and place where it is now. And then also, if you're watching and it's not live anymore, you can still take part in the conversation by leaving a comment in the comment section. I read all of them, respond to as many as I can. And then lastly, if you're new to this channel and you like these types of conversations, you can subscribe for more. Next week, I'm talking again, same time, same place, Tuesday, 7 o'clock Central Africa time. I'm talking to my friend Odin Moja, the Chwana nationalist that's currently in Florida. We're going to be talking about how you invest in your community. So what's the small little things that you can do to, again, manipulate reality in a way that you want and to preserve your community and the things that are worth preserving. So again, thank you very much. I hope you guys have an excellent rest of the week and stay safe. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you again next week. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.